Hello, I'm Christy Potter, and I'm the director of the January series at Calvin University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first presentation of the January series 2021, our first ever all-virtual series. It is so good to be standing on this stage today. What a difficult and challenging year it has been, and I've been thinking about this moment since March, when the stay-at-home orders were announced and our crazy, uncertain COVID experience began. I'm so grateful to our amazing underwriters who continue to believe in the mission of the January series. In particular, today I'd like to thank the Doug and Maria DeVos Foundation and Meyer Incorporated for being our series partners, and all of our daily underwriters that we will recognize throughout the 15 days coming up. This series would not be possible, especially this year, without them. I'm so grateful to a dedicated, talented team of colleagues as well at Calvin who have helped us flip our tried and true lecture series into this virtual event. And thanks to each of you for tuning in. Each day after the presentation, you will receive a brief survey, and I hope you will fill it out so that we can learn more about who is in our audience. Each time you submit a survey, you will be entered to win some free prizes and speaker books at the end of the month. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge that the founding director of the January series, June Hammersma, passed away at the age of 90 this past February, and I believe she'd be very proud of the way the series has grown and flourished. I'm so grateful for her vision and leadership, and I'd like to dedicate the 2021 series to her. I'm really excited about the lineup of speakers that we have this year and what they have to offer us as a Reformed community as it relates to our current cultural moment. Friends, we have a lot to discern, so let's get started. Michael Leroy, president of Calvin University, will introduce today's presenter.
Good afternoon and good morning if you're in another time zone. It is so good to be with you here. We have a few students socially distanced here in the auditorium, and it is great to see them back on campus as well. I also want to extend my deep gratitude to a Calvin team, to Christy Potter, and a Calvin team that's off camera that has really made this adaptation so possible. So we're excited to get going today, and today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Rebekah DeYoung. Want to let you know, though, first, at any time during the talk, please feel free to send us your questions, either by sending it in form of an email to askjseries@calvin.edu or tweeting #AskJSeries. So send in your questions that way, and we will look forward to engaging them later in the conversation today. Our moderator, Karen Saupe, will be asking those questions and facilitating a conversation as time allows. I also want to make sure we thank the Holland Home today for generously underwriting this event. Now, I'm excited for you to hear Professor Rebekah DeYoung. For over 20 years, Rebekah has served as a professor of ethics and the history of ancient and medieval philosophy right here at Calvin University. Her research has focused on topics including the 7 deadly sins, virtue ethics, and Thomas Aquinas' work on virtue. Rebekah is a sought-after speaker and the author of both Glittering Voices and Vainglory, and her work has earned her the Book and Essay Prize from the Character Project, as well as a C.S. Lewis Prize. Today, she's going to help us explore why our hearts are captivated by glittery but false substitutes for true human goodness and happiness. Welcome, Rebekah. We are thrilled to have you kicking off the January series today.
Thank you very much, President Leroy. I'm so grateful to be here today with all of you. I, too, would like to join everyone else by thanking Christy Potter and her team and our today's sponsors. We're so indebted to all of them for putting together a wonderful series again this year. My goal today is to do 2 simple things. First, teach you a little bit about the 7 deadly sins, and secondly, show you how this can change your life. Did anyone else receive a Christmas card with this line from the song, "O Holy Night"? I received several of them. It felt like a theme. I think it may have been a perfect choice, however. A weary world. That pretty much sums up 2020 for all of us, doesn't it? We're so weary, in fact, that a more honest Christmas card might have looked like this. I actually got a card like this too. I love it. Look at that face. No more beautiful shutterfly families dancing on the beach for this little gal. She's having none of it. This is the face of 2020 for me. At the beginning of the pandemic, perhaps we had the energy to bake our own bread and learn a new musical instrument, train for a few virtual marathons, master several new online meeting platforms, extra credit if that included Microsoft Teams. By now, however, it's probably fair to assume that we no longer want to be in the Zoom where it happens. Our strategies for success have worn a little thin. Our distractions are drying up. Our batteries are just drained. If 2020 did anything for us, it was this. It confronted us with ourselves, the unvarnished, cranky sweatpants version, and it showed us how much we needed grace. St. Augustine, in his famous book, The Confessions, tells his own faith story in something like these terms. All of his own efforts to create happiness and success eventually lead him to frustration and failure. When he looks into his own heart at the end of the road, he found a whole lot of emptiness and an unholy mess. In a garden, as he gave way to tears, God asked him this question, "Augustine, why do you keep relying on yourself, only to find yourself unreliable?" Dallas Willard once wrote that God's favorite address is attheendofyourrope.com. Like Augustine, we can still find him there. Now, this story sounds familiar to me because it's like the story that prompted the writing of Glittering Vices in the first place. Years ago, in my first semester of graduate school, I found myself in a seminar on the metaphysics of secondary causation. That is really a thing. After a few days of the metaphysics of secondary causation, I found myself seriously doubting that I was cut out for a philosophy PhD. What in the world was I doing here? Everyone in my class seemed so prepared, so well-informed, which is a nice way of saying it looked like they were a lot smarter than I was. I figured out as soon as I opened my mouth, everyone would instantly peg me as the imposter that I was, and I would melt into a puddle of shame. Have you ever had this feeling? Apparently, it's very common. In fact, a number of my classmates in that very seminar later admitted to me that they felt exactly the same way. But sometime later, in the library, I was reading about the virtues and the vices in a 13th century text by Thomas Aquinas. He described a vice called pusillanimity. Apparently, that's also a thing. And that vice means smallness of soul. Think of your soul this way. This is pusillanimity. Consider Moses at the burning bush, Aquinas said. When confronted by God's call to lead the people out of Egypt, Moses' very first instinct is to shrink back and to stutter 16 reasons why he is completely unqualified for the job. He was sure he would be exposed as a failure as soon as he opened his mouth. I thought, this sounds pretty familiar. Pusillanimity? That's me. Learning the name of this vice in my library carol that day was a moment of epiphany for me. It felt like looking in the mirror and seeing myself clearly for the first time. Ironically, however, naming the struggle within was the first step toward liberation from it. Now, you know as well as I do that Moses' struggle with pusillanimity did not have the last word in his life, because where God calls, he also equips. What Moses and Augustine and I needed was to refocus away from our own too small resources and onto God's infinite power God's unfailing grace. So it turns out, through the reading about this vice, that I was being invited into a better way to live. Sabbath keeping instead of anxious striving. Resting in the fullness of God's love instead of running on fumes. Yes, please. That's the pattern I learned and am still learning. It's the pattern I want to talk to you about today. So inspired by my discovery of pusillanimity, I started to do some further research because that's what professors do. I tracked pusillanimity back to its roots in the vice of sloth, which turned out to be one of the 7 deadly sins. Who knew? But when I started to research the 7 deadly sins, I initially found myself somewhat disappointed. You see, contemporary accounts of the 7 deadly sins had a lot in common. Most of them were superficial caricatures at best. I now have an office full of cultural kitsch on the 7 deadly sins, almost all of it sent to me by well-meaning friends, who often say something like this: Rebekah, I saw this thing on the sins and I immediately thought of you. But the bottom line was, in all of these accounts, none of them were taking sin seriously at all. I even found a game about the 7 deadly sins. It's on the internet, of course. It encourages players to sin to win. And if you do win, you can celebrate your victory with a bottle of the 7 deadly zins. Yes, it's a Zinfandel. I hear it pairs well with fresh fruit. But here's the thing. Sin is not a game. And deep down, we know it. But when I turned to discussions of the 7 deadly sins in contemporary Christian literature, I found a very different problem. They were taking sin very seriously, but they were also dishing out a lot of very high-handed moralizing about sin, mostly other people's sin, along with a lot of blame and shame. Too many people were working with this picture of God. It seemed to me that their approach might actually give you pusillanimity rather than curing it. So I needed a different way to think about the power of sin, to explain my own experience, if nothing else. The proverb writer puts it this way: for our ways are in full view of the Lord. He examines all of our paths. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of sin hold them fast. They will die for lack of discipline, led astray by their own great folly. So the proverb writer's picture goes like this: our own foolhardy choices lead to a condition where we end up trapped or bound by our own bad habits. We've chosen a way of life that's turned out to be self-defeating, self-destructive. That's how the ancient tradition was talking about the vices. Like pusillanimity, these habits add up to a way of life that leaves us struggling, that leaves us entangled. And when you see sin this way, it makes you want to be free. Biblical literature, wisdom literature, contrasts 2 ways of life. So Psalm 1 is sort of a classic case of this. The proverb writers also talk this way. They contrast a way that follows God's wisdom and leads to virtue and righteousness and blessedness, and contrast that with a way of life that follows human folly all the way to frustration and our own demise. This is the right context for thinking about sin in terms of lifelong formation. What if we focused on virtue and vice as habits that add up to a way of life? Interestingly, I think Jesus also picks up on this at the beginning of his ministry, right? The wisest teacher who's ever walked the earth begins his famous sermon with this word: blessed are they, right? And he gives us a list of virtues and a way of life to follow. I actually think Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 is doing something similar. He offers us a more excellent way. It's the way of the virtue of love. Also, the tree picture will come up again, so hold on to that metaphor. How do we turn away from being formed by vice and become formed in virtue instead? How does this formation become a way of life? This is the question that shaped the mission of the early desert Christians. They were the ones who compiled this first distinctive list of vices we now call the 7 deadly sins. In the 4th century, after the persecution of Christianity had abated, Christians found themselves very quickly tempted by worldly power, fame, wealth, and pleasure. All these things were newly available to them. They quickly realized they needed to be very intentional about pursuing a different way of life. So following Jesus' own example in the gospel accounts, they went to the desert to face these temptations head on. And there in the desert, they found the same temptations that we do. As we discovered during the pandemic, if you spend enough time isolated in the wilderness with all the usual distractions stripped away, the brokenness within tends to bubble up. So this community named the most prevalent temptations vices. Their goal was to name them and face them, armed with the Word of God, like Christ in his own desert temptation. Where Adam had succumbed, Christ had conquered. And because Christ had conquered, they could follow. So that's what they did. Here's the way one of these desert community dwellers talks about the process. They compared their spiritual discernment program to the work of a physician who diagnoses disease for the sake of curing the patient. So here is John Cassian. As is the case with the most skilled physicians who not only heal present ills, but also confront future ones with shrewd expertise and forestall them with prescriptions, so also physicians of souls disclose both the causes of the passions that threaten and the means of acquiring health. So there's this twofold movement. They're looking to cure the problem that is, and then looking to the future to forestall any further problems. Because the point of a doctor is not going to find out what's wrong with you so you can feel bad about being sick. The point of going to a doctor is to become well. Any surgery or treatment that we might have to undergo is for the sake of restoring health, restoring life. So under the care of the great physician, identifying what's wrong with us is for the sake of finding a healthy regimen, a healthier way of life, a way to be whole again. So that was their program, and here is their list: gluttony, lust, greed, wrath, a particular kind of dejection or sorrow, envy, sloth, vainglory, and pride. In Glittering Vices, I explain why it's misleading to call these diagnoses the 7 deadly sins. For one thing, there aren't 7. We just listed off 9, actually. Their vice list might be better thought of as a top 10 list of perennial human struggles. Imagine living out in the desert for decades, right? By then you've probably seen it all. Someone asks you, what are the main things people struggle with spiritually out here? And like a seasoned marriage counselor being asked, what are the top 5 things couples fight about? You have your list at the ready. So from the deserts of Egypt in the 4th century to the US in the 21st century, this is the stuff we all find in our hearts when we spend enough time in the wilderness where we can't hide what's inside anymore. The desert Christians also named these the capital vices. They weren't called deadly sins until much, much later in history, because they're not meant to name the deadliest or the worst things that you can do. Rather, these vices function as sources of many other sins. Cassian uses the metaphor of a tree that nourishes branches and produces fruit, or a wellspring of water that poisons everything that flows from it. He says, for a tall and spreading tree of a noxious kind will the more easily be made to wither if the roots on which it depends have first been laid bare or cut. And a pond of water that's dangerous will be dried up at once if the spring and flowing channel which produce it have been carefully stopped up. So this schema of theirs was designed for diagnostic purposes. It was helpful for mapping symptoms on the surface with deeper sources of sin. The idea is you have to get to the root of the problem. So if you see backbiting and gossip and a generous dose of schadenfreude in your life, you might want to dig deeper and look for the vice of envy. If you find callousness toward others' suffering and restless discontent, look deeper for greed or avarice. Hypocrisy and boasting might be a clue that there's vainglory lurking within, and so on for all the others. According to the Desert Christians, there's a complicated hidden network of sin underneath all of our outward behaviors. So their picture of sin and vice is a tree, and look, it's a pretty complicated tree. Here is Adam and Eve at the base of the tree, representing pride. 7 other branches are growing out of the trunk, and each branch is producing fruit. And if you look up in this top right corner, you can see sloth and its offspring vice, pusillanimity. So the point of depicting the vices as a tree is to make the point that sin is organic. It keeps growing, it keeps proliferating. We can't just ignore it. It's not just going to sit there inert inside. We also can't pick off fruit and trim the branches once in a while because, of course, what do trees do? They just grow more. We have to get down to the root of things and grind the stump. Why single out this set of vices, these capital vices, as fertile sources of sin? Why are they the main branches of the tree? Well, they're not the worst things that you can do. Rather, they're the kind of goods you can build your entire life around. You can define yourself in terms of these things. You can ground your identity in them. You can seek them with your whole heart. You can do this because they look like happiness. They look like blessedness. They look like the good life. And that's partly why they trap us in this spin cycle. Whichever one you choose, what you're doing is you're taking a finite good and putting all your infinite hopes in it. And that's why you have to keep going back for more and keep going back for more. And you'll always find that it isn't enough. Remember, as the proverb writer told us, this is the way of folly. When we follow their false promises, we're just fooling ourselves. Ultimately, we can't fill and fulfill ourselves with these things. This is the striving that leaves us running on empty. So the list of the vices is just helping us name specifically the same mistakes we tend to keep falling for over and over again. So it should look really familiar. The human race apparently is quite a broken record when it comes to sinning. That's why this list translates so well, even centuries later. And notice, too, that the root of the tree is pride. This is a do-it-yourself fulfillment program. I choose what happiness looks like, and then I go get it for myself. So Augustine puts it this way: my sin is this. I looked for pleasure and beauty and truth, not in God, but in myself and other created things. And the search led me instead to pain, confusion, and error. This is the way of folly. It leaves our hearts restless. If this Augustinian diagnosis is right, we all have a fatal case of heart disease. We've set our hearts on the wrong things. And that is why the tradition from Augustine all the way to Aquinas classifies the vices as types of disordered loves. When we build a life around these pursuits, we're formed by them. They become well-worn grooves in our character. They shape the way we see the world, the way we respond to it. They mold our hearts and our minds. They set our priorities. They shape our daily routines and our characteristic emotions. That's why vice is a better name for them than sin. They're not a one-time localized injury. They're not a single surfaced wound. They're less like a cut that needs a few stitches and more like a chronic condition that needs continuing treatment and a CAT scan every few months. So that means we can't just stick a Band-Aid on this stuff and rip it off in a few days, right? The rehabilitation and healing is going to take time. So often in ethics, in the ethics courses I teach, the primary question that is focused on by textbooks is what is the right thing to do? We deliberate when we're facing some kind of dilemma between options. Should we do this action or should we do that one? Now, that's certainly a worthwhile question to ask, but studying the vices prompts a different kind of question. It prompts a question about formation. The formation question is this: if I kept doing this kind of thing for the next 5 years, what sort of person would I end up becoming? What kind of character would I have developed? What way of life will I be living? How does formation work? Let's make this practical, okay? Let's try beginning at the end. Here's an exercise in self-examination that I do with my students. I ask them to write the speech that would be given at their funeral. Imagine the eulogy that would be given by a friend or a family member who knew you well, would be willing to be honest. I give them 30 minutes or so. Either we take a field trip to the cemetery, or if it's snowy and cold like it is now, we listen to John Ritter's Requiem while we write. Why this exercise? Well, funerals are one of the few places we still talk about character, where we still use virtue language. The question at a funeral is not what have you accomplished or achieved, but rather, what kind of person were you? What kind of life did you lead? Typically, this exercise prompts us to draw two conclusions. First, most of us haven't reflected much about this at all. And secondly, most of us discover a pretty significant gap between the person we are now and the person we're called to become. And once we realize that we are not yet all that we're meant to be, once we see that gap, we realize there's a pretty long road ahead. So the Desert Program echoes the way the New Testament scriptures talk about this transformation process. In the New Testament, Paul says in a number of passages things like this: put to death whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And then he lists off a number of vices: lust and greed and idolatry. He says, you used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived. Now you've taken off the old self with its habits and practices, and you're putting on the new self, which is being renewed in the image of its creator. Then when he talks about the new self and the Christ-like character we're supposed to be putting on, he's using virtue talk. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. He always has to include patience on that list. It's very convicting. Over all these virtues, he says, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. If we continue Paul's clothing metaphor here, we might find that at first, this new clean shirt of virtue feels a little stiff, a little uncomfortable. It certainly feels less natural and less comfortable than that well-worn pandemic sweatpants you wore when you were your old self. But gradually, as you continue to wear compassion, kindness, and gentleness, you'll find that Christ-like virtues feel better and are a much better fit. So there are two ways to be formed: a vice tree and a virtue tree. The ultimate question this prompts is, where are you rooted? How are you growing? What fruit are you bearing? When I wrote the first edition of Glittering Vices, however, it wasn't yet clear to me that there was more to this story. You take off vices, you put on virtues. Looks like that's all there is to say, right? But I think we need to be careful here. We can't confuse spiritual growth with climbing the ladder of successful discipleship. The language of achievement and performance, our own willpower, our striving, it just doesn't fit here. Yes, we do need to be intentional and reflective about our formation, but that does not mean adopting some new Christian self-help program of virtue cultivation. That ladder leads nowhere. If we think we can practice harder to make the virtue team, we will either end up with pride in our own progress or pusillanimous despair about our failure. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is pretty blunt about this. He says, apart from me, you can do nothing. At the same time, the Holy Spirit does invite us to keep growing. Grace isn't just fairy dust you sprinkle over the top of your life as it is to give it some godly sparkle, and then you're done. Right? This is actually a new way of life we're being invited into, after all. So our participation will be part of the process. So that means the virtue-vice picture needs an addition, the addition of the spiritual disciplines. That's what completes the transformation picture and bridges the gap. So here's the definition, rough and ready. Spiritual disciplines are ways of being intentional, paying attention, being receptive, opening our lives to transformation by God's Spirit. Because you don't become virtuous without grace and the powerful inner work of the Holy Spirit. Please note, we are not ultimately in control of how that goes. It's not that you do sort of virtuous thing A, B, and C, and you get outcome X in 30 days or whatever it is. Please note, the process can be very messy in the middle. Transformation and growth don't always happen on our preferred timetable or on our own terms. Formation might take many seasons of growth and change, and they keep coming around year after year, again and again. So this is one reason I think the church year is structured as a circle. It's designed to keep walking us through these seasons of confession, taking off the old habits, and through seasons of celebrating what's being brought to life in us. There's a rhythm to this, right? Times of fasting, times of feasting, times of silence, times of singing. I know that Lent comes around every year for a reason. By the time it does, I know that I need it again. That doesn't mean we're not making progress, of course. It just means that when it comes to spiritual transformation, there's always room to grow. Now, I like to keep things practical here, so I want to illustrate this pattern of transformation with two examples from the vice list. First, vainglory. Vainglory is a pretty unfamiliar term, I think, to most of us, but it was a very important element of desert spirituality, and it's one that translates remarkably well today. The good that gets distorted in this vice is attention and affirmation from others. Without that good, we can't practice things like encouragement or gratitude or celebration. Those are all good things, right? As parents, mentors, and role models, our goodness has to be something that's on display for other people to see. But of course, the desire for attention and approval can very, very easily be twisted. There are so many things to get this wrong that I wrote an entire book on vainglory, but I'll give you the short version here. Here's hopefully a familiar face. This will help you picture vainglory. Please note that vainglory is a tale as old as time. Please also note that this film came out long before social media, so we can't just blame TikTok for causing our vainglory problems. Can you even imagine what this guy would be like on TikTok? He's bad enough in your local tavern. As an example of vainglory, though, even though he's a little over the top, he helps us get the idea. We can also take an example that might hit a little closer to home. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus notes that religious people who pray loudly on street corners or eloquently on stages also have this vice. So there are Christian forms of this one, too. Uh-oh. Remember, studying the vices is just for self-examination. It's really not designed for finger-pointing. The question is, where am I vulnerable to vainglory? So we can all use this quiz to look in our own mirror. Question number 1. Have you ever exaggerated something you've done or made up a story about something you've not actually done in order to impress those who are listening? Question number 2. Have you ever said something false or bad about another person in order to get your friends to think you're really funny and entertaining? Question number 3. Have you ever spent time trying to receive recognition or approval for the car that you drove or the job you have, the music you listen to, the books you've read, how respectable a Christian you are, how well-behaved your children are, how beautifully crafted your ministry resume is, etc., etc. Number 4, have you ever spent too much time worrying about a task or performance? I don't know, preparing for the January series or something, because you were so concerned about others' approval or disapproval. Right, you get the idea. This one, I think, hits home for all of us, doesn't it? If it makes you feel any better, I originally designed these quiz questions based on episodes in the life of St. Augustine. So this is definitely a perennial human temptation. The question it leaves us with, of course, is how do we get from the vice of vainglory to Christ-like virtue? This might be looking more difficult by the minute. So as an intentional next step, my students and I tried a modified form of the spiritual discipline of silence. Now, we only did this for a week. We thought at the beginning of the exercise that we wouldn't have too much trouble just refraining from talking about ourselves for a week. So you didn't have to be completely silent. You could still, raise your hand in class, and you could still order something at a restaurant, whatever. But you couldn't share your own opinions about your professor in class. You couldn't share your thoughts about a movie or a football game that you just watched. You couldn't make any excuses or rationalize your own behavior. You couldn't post on social media. All right, what we found is that we couldn't even remember to practice this exercise. We'd be halfway through a conversation and realize, we were talking about ourselves again. It was so habitual. It was so deep in us. We couldn't believe it. Like Abba Agatho in the desert, we found that we needed to keep a pebble in our mouth for 3 years to teach ourselves silence. Most of us used a Tic Tac instead, or a piece of gum. But by the end of the week, we found ourselves very, very convicted. Right? Most of our conversation about ourselves wasn't legitimate sharing. It was a little too self-centered. But this discipline doesn't just expose our inner me monster and shut down all our bigger and better stories, right? It also creates room for others to speak. It's a space-creating discipline. It invites us to listen. It teaches us to pay attention to what other people are saying. It opens places for others to share themselves. Strikingly, after only a week, my students reported that this made a difference in their friendships. It was pretty telling. When we open our lives to God's spirit of transformation, we're not only taking off vices, dying to old habits, at the same time, we're also being formed and trained in a better, more life-giving way. The disciplines do both. No matter how many times we do this exercise, I feel like I always notice something new. So if you try this at home, you will see this for yourself. Silence cultivates attentiveness to others. It enables us to notice and appreciate beauty and goodness around us without grasping for the limelight or the microphone ourselves. Right? How this goes, however, is not scriptable. It's not predictable. When we let the Spirit in, God changes us wherever and however we need to change. Second example, the vice of wrath. Again, we're going to start with the idea that anger can be a good thing. It's the desire to set things right. Well-ordered anger expresses a hunger and a thirst for righteousness, for justice. Of course, we all think we're for just causes, right? Wrathful anger, disordered anger, takes 2 forms. First, it can have the wrong target. It can serve our own selfish causes rather than just causes. And it can be excessive. It can either be too vehement or we can hold on to our anger too long. So again, let's do some self-examination to start. In this exercise, we spent a week tracking every time we were angry in a journal, right? And we tracked 2 things. First of all, what is the target of our anger? What are we angry about? And secondly, how angry were we? 1, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 is low and 5 is really angry, all right? Now, when we started this exercise, we thought, okay, we know we're human. We're going to have some episodes of bad anger. All right, we're just going to admit that right up front. We'll have some good and some bad, and then we'll kind of see where the percentages fall. But here's what we found. By the time we canvassed our political conversations, our contemptuous commentary on whatever we were watching on the screen, our Twitter feed, and our attitude in traffic. We were left wondering if there was any good anger in us at all. We had vanishingly few examples. So we were left pretty convicted. We were left wondering, is there any good anger in me? And if not, what in the world am I going to do about it? So what do we do now? We can do a lot, of course, to manage wrathful symptoms with practice. We can take deep breaths. We can give ourselves timeouts to calm down. We can reframe the situation. These are all good things to do. But ultimately, we need to dig down to the spiritual roots of wrath and ask ourselves, why am I so angry? Evagrius, one of the Desert Fathers, prompts us to ask this question: what is my anger guarding? He says, do not give an evil sword to the devil by getting inflamed by anger. Over what, pray tell me, do you fall to fighting, if indeed you have scorned food, riches, and esteem? And why do you feed the dog of anger if you claim to own nothing? That dog of anger will keep barking and attacking people because obviously it has possessions inside. It wants to guard them. So the question the desert community prompts us to ask is this: what possessions, what picture of ourselves, what agenda am I so attached to that I feel like I need to defend it with my best energy and my fiercest weapons? Wrath reveals what we really love. Remember, the vices are a heart condition. Ultimately, as one spiritual writer phrased it, our anger is guarding a kingdom, guarding it against insults or threats. So we need to ask ourselves, whose kingdom is it? Why am I holding a sword? Who am I pointing it at? Does my anger fit this prayer? Yours is the kingdom. Yours is the power. Yours is the glory forever. I don't know about you, but this one hits me pretty hard. Wrath is an area of great struggle for many of us. And if we didn't already know that, 2020 held up a pretty clear mirror. Back to the desert Christians, because they also give us remarkable examples of a different, more virtuous, more life-giving way. Listen to this story from the desert. One day, the brothers surrounded Abijah when he was sitting in front of the church, helping them discern their thoughts. So he's practicing spiritual direction, helping his disciples. Another old man, a rival elder, flares up in envy at the sight. And he says, Abijah, your cup is full of poison. Public insult, a slap in the face. How does Abijah respond? He answers, yes, Father, it is. But you have said this when you can only see the outside of the cup. What would you say if you saw the inside too? Abijah's humility is disarming. Do you see something of the character of Christ in him? How do we get to be like that? How do we put on the virtues of Christ? Gentleness, humility, patience. This is not about practicing harder. This is about giving up the driver's seat. Being in the driver's seat, literally and metaphorically, is a good name for our wrath problem. We are too in love with our own control. We are too attached to our own agenda. The spiritual discipline of slowing helps us accept the Spirit's invitation to give up the driver's seat. If it makes you feel any better, I invented this exercise for myself. It's actually in the chapter on wrath and glittering vices. So 3 things. At stoplights, stop and realize that waiting is an opportunity. It's an invitation to pay attention to God's presence in your car and to simply be with Him. Secondly, don't speed. Hurry leads to being irritated and impatient with others. Third, and perhaps most difficult, pray for those who pass you. They need your intercession more than your imprecations. Remember, the discipline is designed to strip away, to take off the old self, but also to create something new in us, to usher in a new way of seeing the world, a new way of being and living. If you don't think practicing this discipline will make a difference for you, then it's homework for you. I challenge you to try it. So to summarize, the spiritual disciplines invite us to open our hands, to say yes to God's grace. The disciplines are an opportunity to open our hearts, to open every inch of our lives up to God's gracious and transforming work. Please note, they are embodied, right? They involve your hands. They're concrete things to do with our hands and our feet in our daily practices and our daily rhythms of life. And note, secondly, that whatever we do as individuals is best embedded in the body of Christ. These rhythms of life need to be shared. We need to learn from each other and also encourage each other along the way. Why should we study the vices? I hope you have something of an answer by now. It's because they're part of this baptismal rhythm of spiritual formation, dying to our old sinful selves, our old habits and practices, our old ways of life, and then rising to new life in Christ, being clothed with the virtues that make us more and more like him. To participate in this rhythm is to be in step with the Spirit. The goal, of course, of all of this is to put on the whole character of Christ himself. Discipleship, as Dallas Willard often put it, is the process of becoming who Jesus would be if he were me. You may have tuned into this talk today thinking you were going to get a pretty heavy-duty lecture on sin. Instead, I hope you have received a word of hope, a word that a weary world surely needs to hear. Madeleine L'Engle's words capture both our honest confession and God's gracious response of healing. She says, "In flesh's solitude, I count it blessed that only you, Lord, can see my heart, with passion's darkness tearing it apart, with storms of self and tempests of unrest. But your love breaks through my blackness. It bursts in with light. Healed by your love, corruption and decay are turned, and whole we greet the light of day." Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Karen Salpe from the English department, and I'll be taking your questions. You can tweet them to hashtag AskJSeries or email them to askjseries@calvin.edu. I want to start by asking about the question of why the dejection or sorrow sin got dropped from the list.
Yes, a lot of the vices ended up being combined with each other because they were similar or dealt with similar phenomena. So the sorrow or dejection, which is a very particular kind of sorrow, not sorrow in general, it got folded into sloth, which was a sin that also has a kind of dejected, depressive kind of melancholic feel to it. And then likewise, vainglory and pride got conflated with each other as the list went by because they were so similar in character as well.
You've partly answered the question of why it's so attractive to categorize sin in this way. I think of Dante's Inferno and how just fascinating it is to see everything categorized. Is it because it's truly helpful? Is it because it oversimplifies something?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you can certainly sort of obsessively catalog things, and you can oversimplify things. But I think the worry here is that when you think about sin, if your prayer is only, sort of forgive us from our sins, generically, you're not actually doing anything to name a particular struggle at a particular time. So if our confession needs some fine-tuning, if we need to sort of name things in order to recognize them and realize what we're dealing with, then the vice list can be helpful. I mean, any list, any categorization, of course, can be overused or underused, but if you use it well, like this desert community did so effectively. I mean, their work got picked up by John Cassian, Cassian got picked up by Benedict of Nursia, and Benedictine monasteries used it for the next 1,000 years. Well, they're still using it today. So I think there's some practical evidence that this particular vice list has some staying power, some diagnostic power, that people find it genuinely helpful in understanding what they're struggling with and then finding ways to break free.
On a related note, a Calvin parent writes, you mentioned how in Cassian's list and others there were 9 deadly sins or destructive passions. Do you think these can be mapped onto the 9 types in the traditional Enneagram?
The Enneagram always comes up. Let me say this. There are, as things move along in the history, and I talk more about this in the book, you get the vice list pared down to 7 with pride as the root, so that would be 8. So you're not going to get an exact mapping necessarily, but the 7 are correlated with different Enneagram types along with fear and deceit. So the Enneagram actually adds those 2 features, which don't show up explicitly on the vice list. And there we could have an interesting conversation about why those were worthy additions or not. I think the most important thing, again, is to use these tools for targeted diagnostic purposes, not to sort of typify people in an overly simplistic way.
When I read your book, every chapter I thought, oh, that's mine. That's my deadly sin. And needless to say, that I think there was one I felt didn't fit me. I probably was just confused.
You skipped that chapter.
Yeah.
Imagine how I felt writing it. It was terrible.
Seriously, yes. I'm glad to hear that they're capital, not deadly.
Yes.
It's more helpful to think of them as source sins. In discussions on lust, Christian purity culture has often diminished the goodness of sexuality in favor of emphasizing the shamefulness of sexual sin. Do you have any thoughts on how to discuss lust in a way that preserves the value of sexuality while still condemning the sin?
Yeah, that's actually a pattern that I would want to apply to all of the vices. So in each case, what you have to do is identify what good created thing you're starting with, and then identify in the ways in which it's getting twisted or disordered. So in each case, if you can't name the good at stake, you're just sort of not fitting the pattern at all. So in the case of lust, you have to start with the created goodness of our bodies and our embodied sexuality. And of course, when you think about lust, it isn't just a symptom check, right? It's not just behavioral stuff we're concerned about. We're concerned about the deeper attachments of the heart that lie behind it. So in any number of the vices, we might be tempted to sort of pick out external behaviors that are red flags, and in some cases that's appropriate. But I think the more important question, like Evagrius with anger, is not what angry symptoms are you showing, but rather what's at the root of anger? What is the root of lust in your life? Why are you so tempted to seek disorder in this way? In what way is this good filling and fulfilling happiness for you instead of looking to God for the kind of deep, loving relationship that anchors then all of our human relationships?
Here are a couple of related questions. One listener writes, I struggle with knowing how to and how much to celebrate the goodness of God and the gifts He's given us when there's so much pain in the world. Mm-hmm. And to me, that connects with questions about righteous anger, righteous wrath. So the other question is, wrath is listed as a deadly sin, but you use the word anger. Are they the same thing? Mm-hmm. But the ultimate question here is, how should we handle our anger with injustice? Mm-hmm. And let me add that I'm not going to ask any of the questions that are being sent in about what's happening in politics today, but we're all feeling it from wherever we sit.
Yeah, there are so many occasions of anger. Okay, so the way to distinguish anger from wrath, anger is going to be the human emotion that can be a good thing, is a good thing. It's designed to sort of flag injustice for us, flag things that aren't right, and give us a response of no. Now, how can that response get twisted? I think in each case, when we're looking at the way the vices work in our lives, we're always going to find sort of a little too much ego involved here. There's always a little bit too much of our own kingdom that we sort of have a stake in. So again, communal discernment is deeply important to hear, and I think communal discernment requires talking to people who disagree with you, right? And trying to understand what loves and what good things move them. In the same way that we have to think about our own angry responses in terms of what are the deep loves here that move me to respond to this situation in this way. So when we're trying to sort of think about anger as a response to justice and then apply that in a particular situation, ask yourself, what is at stake here for me? What goods do I feel are threatened, and why do I feel like I have to respond to them? And in particular, what way am I called to respond as opposed to someone else? So when you think about these we can often think about our own heart and our own individual response, but corporately speaking, the body of Christ is called to respond to injustice. And that isn't sort of a one-size-fits-all program, right? Some of us might be called to sort of work administratively behind the scenes on new legislation, and other people might be called to sort of call out injustice, speak truth to power out in the streets. Some of us might be called to pray behind the scenes. So what our response is might depend on what our calling is in the body of Christ. Are we sort of in a prophetic role, or a priestly role, or a mediating role, or a kingly role where we have administration to do? So thinking about who we are and what our particular call is, I think can be a helpful discernment process in terms of anger and many other of the vices.
So circling back to the original comment, do you find joy and hope in the kind of agency that we have to act against injustice?
Absolutely. I mean, we wouldn't have a good role for anger if we weren't called to respond to set things right. We're called to partner with the Spirit, right? We don't sort of pray that the Spirit will just do stuff and we don't have to be involved, right? None of the disciplines work like that. We're going to be called to involvement, and we need to discern that. So I think there is within anger, the emotion, both lament at what's not right and hope for making things better. And we have to honor both of those movements, I think, in anger.
Thank you. I think this is an alum, asks, have you studied such lists in other cultures that may not have been Christian, and are there similarities in other belief systems?
Yeah, so there isn't something like a distinctive sin list called the 7 deadly sins in other cultures. But of course, there are similar spiritual practices like fasting and silence and meditation and so on. And it's an interesting and I think complicated sorting and translation exercise to see whether there is common ground in certain instances or not. And I think one of the interesting features of the Christian story about how spiritual disciplines get integrated into our Christian life is that there's a heavy emphasis on grace. So this is not a self-transformation process. This is not a I do virtue better program. And I think that emphasis, at least I note that is missing in many other traditions when they're working with spiritual disciplines. It's more of a make my own effort kind of program. So there's a lot more to say about that, obviously, but I think grace is a pretty interesting Christian distinctive.
Great. Someone who may be an old classmate wonders how the discipline of cross-country helped shape your spiritual formation.
There's a lot of hard work involved in cross-country. However, this isn't really about hard work. I mean, I think in the end, it's about receptivity. The spiritual, and that was something that I had to learn. I mean, I can criticize many other books in virtue ethics and in positive psychology and even some in theology that are kind of leaning a little too heavy on the habituation and virtue cultivation side of things. And there's a certain amount of that that's involved, right? We have to participate in the disciplines. We have to be intentional. There are rhythms of life here. But I think the most important thing is to understand that these are just scaffolding for the Spirit's work. So Benedict has a rule of life that he recommends to his community, and he describes that as a regula, or we usually translate that as a rule of life, but it can also mean a kind of trellis on which a plant can grow. And I think that's a beautiful image of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to set up a trellis. It's going to require some effort on our part. But ultimately, how the growth happens, where and when it happens, is up to the Spirit. I mean, as a kind of a funny story, I attempted some fasting when I was early on and sort of understanding this whole tradition, and thought, oh, I should be trying some of these things. And so I tried fasting, and I didn't find it that terribly difficult. The first 2 weeks were terrible, but Lent is long. So by the third week, I thought, okay, I'm kind of in the rhythm of this thing. But what I found is that while I didn't struggle with the food part of the fasting, I did struggle with the fact that I was tired all the time because I couldn't sort of fuel up on the caffeine and the sugar and all the rest of it. And I got a little crabby with God later in the process, and I tell this story in the book. And I had a conversation with him that went something like this: God, I gave you the food thing, but I did not give you my agenda, my calendar, and my to-do list. And now you're messing with that, right? So I think the idea is when you let the Spirit in, it's going to come and do whatever work needs to be done, regardless of whether you've set training goals for yourself or you have a desired outcome. That's really not what it's all about. So although discipline is necessary, perhaps it's not the most important part of the story.
There's a tension here between an American valuing of liberty as my own liberty and my own sense of self-control versus the kind of liberty, the kind of freedom that we have in surrendering to God. One of our staff members asks, do you think current American culture has some healthy spiritual disciplines already? Are there places where our current culture is healthy and virtuous?
Well, I think the pandemic has been an interesting exercise for us, and that's why I began this talk with the opportunities that it's afforded. I think a lot of people have looked at what happened to family life during pandemic shutdown, and for many families that was devastating and difficult, but for other families there were opportunities there. There was time together that they hadn't shared. There was a kind of intentional being together that we hadn't had to experience before. So I do think that the kind of stripping away of distractions and busyness that happened for many families was a good thing for us, and invited us, I think, helped us see by experience how good things can be if we simplify. And of course, the discipline of simplicity is one of the classic spiritual disciplines.
Assuming that your book would be number one, are there other books that you can recommend on the topic for a general audience?
Sure. John Ortberg was our graduation speaker several years ago, and he has a book called The Life You've Always Wanted, which goes through exactly this sort of exercises of the spiritual disciplines and the ways that they can give us freedom and a better life. I would always recommend everything by Dallas Willard, The Divine Conspiracy in particular. Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, is just a classic in this area. James Bryan Smith's The Good and Beautiful Life is another good example.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Rebekah DeYoung. I also want to thank the Holland Home for underwriting today's presentation and our series underwriters, the Doug and Maria DeVos Foundation and the Meyer Corporation. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.